doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
On behalf of Africa Investor, I'd like to welcome you. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the second African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum COVID-19 Virtual Roundtable. My name is Hubert Danso, and I am the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor, and I will be the co-chair for today's roundtable. Before we start, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to each of you, in particular the delegation from the International Federation of Sovereign Wealth Funds, colleagues from the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, the CEO of PGGM, one of Europe's largest pension funds, the CEO of the World Pensions Council out of Paris, CEO and chairman from BATSETA, South Africa's largest association of pension funds, which essentially represents 70% of all pension assets under management across the entire continent of Africa, including the Government Employees Pension Fund of South Africa. I'd like to welcome our colleagues and friends from One Planet, which is President Macron's group of the leading and largest sovereign wealth funds committed to climate change. Also the CEO of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, the CEO and chairman of the Kenyan Consortium of Pension Funds, the CEO of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority and our co-chair for today, the CEO and leadership team from Itmar Capital, Morocco's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the CEO of Erscom Provident Pension Fund, CEO of FONSIS, the Senegalese Sovereign Wealth Fund, the CEO of the Egyptian Sovereign Fund, the Kenyan Sovereign Fund Chairman, the CEO of the Government Institutions Pension Fund of Namibia, representatives from Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, Casey Family Programs Endowment, and all other sovereign funds and leaders here present. You're most welcome. Again, I'd like to thank you firstly for making the time to participate in this consultative roundtable process. As they say, a week is a long time, particularly in the times that we live in, not just in politics. In other parts of the world, particularly around the globe, we're now seeing China reopen in many respects its economy. The US set out its criteria and framework yesterday for states to reopen their economies. Germany and Denmark are sending their kids back to school. And the oil war is gradually, or it looks apparently, although I wouldn't bank on it holding, it looks like it's subsiding enough to support a Q2 sort of 20 Brent oil price forecast of about $35 per barrel, and genuine prospects, hopefully, of the price reverting to the long-term equilibrium of about $50 per barrel in 2021. I think, as we mentioned on previous roundtables, there are a number of important initiatives that I'd like to just restate and share with you again that are being taken by our constituency and key stakeholders within our ecosystem as asset owners and financiers. Firstly, our colleague who's going to speak about it a bit later on today, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority has allocated $150 million from its stabilization fund to fight COVID-19. The Moroccan government is establishing a COVID-19 dedicated fund to tackle the pandemic. The African Union and the African private sector have put together a COVID-19 response fund, seeded with about $150 million, with aspirations and progress towards $400 million. The African Development Bank has listed a COVID-19 social bond on the London Stock Exchange and established a $3 billion COVID-19, and established a $10 billion COVID-19 response facility. Our friends and colleagues at the African Export-Import Bank have established a $3 billion COVID-19 trade facility. And on the international front, you're seeing asset owners and pension funds taking a number of steps. Caisse de dépôt of Quebec, CDPQ, have established a $4 billion facility for investments to support locally affected businesses in Quebec, and a $300,000 community donation assistance. We're seeing innovation from the Russian Direct Investment Fund, RDIF, which is Russia's sovereign wealth fund, that's invested in a diagnosis system for the detection of COVID-19. The Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency has launched a $6.5 billion fast-track facility to help investors tackle COVID-19. And the European development finance institutions, with a number of support lines to millions of productive jobs in Africa, this week announced the COVID-19 African private sector job protection measures that they will be pursuing, including but not limited to mobilizing new capital, increasing risk tolerance, temporary suspension of minimum return requirements, and new credit lines and guarantees from donors of between 2 to 5 billion euros. A significant number of African countries, as you've seen in the press, have received IMF debt relief and disbursements. But in spite of this, our continent's COVID-19 statistics, as of yesterday, recorded 17,701 cases, 916 deaths, and 3,585 recoveries. And we still have not peaked yet. So colleagues, our work continues, and today's objective is to advance and give practical effect to our inaugural roundtable consultations by translating our 7 recommendations into practical actions and proposals. These recommendations relate specifically to our 2 major thematic areas guiding our roundtable consultations, which is the first being to look at immediate priority responses to protect African capital markets, SMEs, supply chains, and the African continental free trade area from the economic fallout of COVID-19. And the second anchor thematic area is to focus on partnerships with regulators to foster industry shifts and the next normal regulatory environment required for African economies and industry to not only thrive, but to also grow. Just to restate, the 7 recommendations are to recommendation number 1, collaborate on SME and supply chain and trade support initiatives through digitization, particularly trade and fintech, especially in the healthcare and the agri sector, and in the sort of trade enabling regtech environments. Recommendation number 2 is to pursue ESG compliant infrastructure co-investment partnerships with a heavy emphasis on energy, healthcare, agri and trade related infrastructure, to build that resilient infrastructure, not only to fight today's COVID-19 challenges, but also to anticipate and mitigate for future pandemics, which we have good information that we will see each and every 6 years at least. Recommendation number 3 is to develop and communicate seminal pandemic combative institutional investment models and approaches to investing and unleash a new degree of creativity in that respect. Recommendation number 4 is to champion institutional investor research insights, where we can share some of our expertise and our knowledge. We are much more than capital. We are beyond capital in terms of our long-term capacity and expertise. So recommendation number 5 is to motivate governments to consider directing some of the quantitative easing and emergency funding towards sovereign wealth funds to allocate and invest into their local and regional economies. Recommendation number 6 is to engage in policy partnerships, principally with central bank governors, on framing the new regulatory environment and investment needs of the post-COVID-19 economy. And recommendation number 7 is to coordinate and correlate, in particular, responses with global peer institutional investor and private sector industry bodies. We have a number of really good people that are going to be joining us today. But before that, we all agreed at our first roundtable that, as African institutional investors and global institutional investors and the institutional investment community as a whole, we are uniquely placed to support African governments and policymakers through our unparalleled expertise on long-term investing. And we can really help the policymakers plan for and anticipate long-term investment needs, risks, and priorities, so African economies can stabilize, grow, and thrive, as I mentioned before, in the new post-COVID-19 economy. And especially, what we're going to be focusing on today in that respect is really looking to table some very specific ideas and proposals and next steps for each of the 7 recommendations, and share a number of different perspectives. And a number of our leaders here are going to be talking about the role of African sovereign wealth funds in the response to COVID-19 and the context of the 7 recommendations and more broader views. And round table speakers for today include Mr. Solomon Asamoah, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, Mr. Uche Orji, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, NSIA, Mr. Mbui Wagacha, who is the former acting chair of the board of the Central Bank of Kenya and chair of the Kenyan Sovereign Wealth Fund. We have Mr. Ayman Soliman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sovereign Fund of Egypt. We have Mr. Duncan Bonfield, who is the Chief Executive of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. We have Mr. John Denton, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris. We have Mr. Obed Amran, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Itmar Capital, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Morocco. We have Mr. Demba Diallo, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Francis, the Strategic Investment Sovereign Fund of Senegal. We have Mr. Eloy Lindiger, who is the Chief Executive Officer of PGGM Investment Management from the Netherlands. We have Mr. Nick Bursley, who is the Director General of the World Pensions Council. And we have Edo Amanoven, who is the President of the African Securities Exchanges Association, ASIA. But before we kick off, by way of housekeeping, please ensure your computer audio is on mute. The roundtable format today is that each discussion leader will speak, and that we will address all questions at the end of the succession of speakers' remarks. We're on a strict 5-minute for each speaker regime to allow for time for discussion at the end. So please be concise. So to get us going, I'm going to jump in and address recommendation number 1, which is to collaborate on assisting SME supply chains and trade support through digitization, e-trade and fintech, especially in the healthcare and the agri-related sectors. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you now the Africa PLC initiative that we're working on with a number of key strategic partners. So I'm going to open up my screen for you to get a view and just take you through a presentation which I believe will really address this particular area. We have some phenomenal partners like the International Chamber of Commerce, like the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, like DHL, like the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Standard Bank, Absa Bank, Trade Development Bank, the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, and a number of other key partners, driving the to make this a really operational and exciting support platform for SMEs, corporates, and procuring governments. So I'm now going to start the presentation. So I'm going to seek to share my screen with you, and I will count on you to tell me that you can see what I have there. Do you see a slide that says Africa PLC?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
We can.
Okay, fantastic. So as I mentioned, this particular recommendation addresses some of the key issues that have been thrown up by COVID-19. I think we are all very familiar with the concept now of social distancing. And it's really taught us to really exist and function in a very digital environment. So excuse me, I think my screen has gone to the wrong one. Let me just hopefully enlarge it for you. Great. So what we are looking at here is an initiative that I'm going to talk you through, which is one that addresses, in our view, social distancing, but also takes account of how we can enfranchise and support small and medium-sized enterprises, the African private sector, and key industries on a pan-African basis that ultimately drives SME enfranchisement and uses technology to help the private sector, our own private sectors, develop local supply chains. One of the key things that's come up as a consequence of the challenges that have been thrown up by the pandemic are the whole issue of the lack of access to the inputs and our overall dependence on global supply and the lack of investment in our own domestic infrastructure related trade, logistics, supply chains. So I think many of us have heard about the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think it's probably one of those initiatives that we can probably remember calling for about 15 or 20 years ago. And in 2015, the leaders from the African Union came together and made it happen, put all the necessary protocols in place, and created what is commonly regarded as a $4 billion market opportunity, and essentially, by virtue of number of countries, the largest trade area in the world. And, we've looked at this and tried to understand, at the political level, we seem to have an environment now that is going to work for us. And now we need to see how we can work for it from a private sector standpoint. So we have been working very closely with the African Union, because I also chair their Continental Business Network, which focuses on bringing institutional capital and project and structured and long-term finance to support Pan-African infrastructure investments. And this was one of the initiatives that we are focusing on there, to really not only just look at how we can support big business, but how we can also support small and medium-sized enterprises in a digital environment. So Africa PLC is the current sort of name of this particular initiative to bring the African private sector, African capital into being able to create that digital economy for the continent. So essentially, Africa PLC at its most simplest as an initiative, and hopefully in line with our recommendation, is designed to be an innovative platform that supports our governments procure, as they are some of the largest procurers on our continent, on a business to government basis, as well as a business to business level, because we've seen a lot of business to consumer, B2C in the market, but we're looking to accelerate our own degrees of industrialization and create the conditions for our ability to scale the private sector. So, you know, we have taken the view and worked with a number of great partners. Some of them are on the call now. We have the International Chamber of Commerce, we have the UNDP, we have Sovereign from the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, because it's been made very clear that this ultimately is what's going to be required to build a resilient African private sector, one that can function and compete digitally, one that can, you know, access and stimulate local industrial economic development by, you know, looking at the opportunities for funds like, you know, African asset owners, as well as institutional investors from abroad, to be able to invest in very productive domestic economic infrastructure. So this is a platform that will be able to intermediate key data to look at where the specific opportunities and needs are. It will give opportunities to be able to promote and profile the actual companies, the key buyers, the sellers, the financiers, the ancillary service providers, and the actual trade financiers, all in one environment. There's one thing that we've seen a lot of from the you know, this whole pandemic, which is everyone is now trying to procure PPEs, personal protective equipment. There is no one single place on the continent where we can actually go right now and even understand who can supply that in the continent, you know, what the best procurement opportunities are there trade, finance, and other insurance-related products that can support that. So this is the type of digital environment that will bring together all of those different pieces. The role players in terms of the companies, buyers, the sellers, the financiers, and in this particular platform, we're actually looking at focusing on, with the partnerships that we have, and in particular with the UNDP, we're looking at 5 pilot countries, and we're going to be starting, because of the COVID response, by focusing on the healthcare and pharmaceuticals industry, as well as the agriculture and the agribusiness and the FMC vertical, purely because of the food security dynamic, and the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry for obvious reasons. And you will see that there are a number of other ones that will come online later: automotive component parts, construction and engineering, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I wouldn't spend too much time just talking about the trade complexities that exist in continent, but I think it can be summed up in the saying that we hear from a lot of our politicians, and ultimately the one-liner that almost got the African Continental Free Trade Area over the line, which is, you know, as a continent, we produce what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce. And that has essentially led us to not addressing a number of these different trade barriers and investing in the local critical supply chains that would be potentially a big difference maker as we address this pandemic around the PPEs, the food security related issues, and as well as the trade related infrastructure that we would need to be able to evacuate these particular goods and services and opportunities on a continent-wide basis. So ultimately, this just shows you very briefly and quickly that what this will do for the small and medium-sized enterprises, marketplace for the buyers, that one-stop environment that I just sort of mentioned, offering logistics solutions and trade finance, the logistics partner here, is DHL, and it also creates an opportunity for an aggregation of many other suppliers. And at the bottom line, it just reduces the cost and the friction of actually transacting and trading. For the corporates, it's a procurement hub with your typical ERP type solutions to enable and assist larger corporates to be able to enfranchise their own supply chains, to be able to do more business with a much wider and more easily identifiable community of buyers and sellers and financiers. The reason the governments are so supportive of this is because it's going to really help them as the budgets tighten. This is going to really help them look at how to rationalize procurement. So one of the key tenets and features of the government solution is the crowd buying procurement hub, which will be able to direct spend on a conglomerated basis to unlock greater efficiencies. And of course, in line with what a number of the governments want to do, there's a big local content metric in there, which enables governments to be able to address some of their local content aspirations, as well as help the local manufacturers get access to the trade finance, because some of the governments are actually going to be funding them. And you will just see the way that it's constellated. At its most simplest, it's a number of vertical markets, as I said, by industry, and then it's the ancillary services, export credit insurance, trade finance, and a number of other services that one would typically see in the value chain around any particular transaction. This very quickly shows you how the companies will log in, and this sort of highlights the blockchain trade finance component and the initial offering: auto settlement, bank payment undertakings, bank payment undertaking financing, and invoice financing. And we've been able to bring together for this project an impressive group of banks from across the world, and to link in with banks from across the continent, all providing trade finance to address our $120 billion trade finance deficits that we actually have on the continent. These banks, for the first time, will be able to work together on a blockchain hyperledger platform, which has been graciously developed by IBM. So that ultimately will give the platform and the African private sector procuring governments access to a global environment, and it will also give the globe and the main economic trade and investment players access to trade on the continent. This just very quickly shows you the tenets of the partnership with DHL. It's essentially a big logistics partnership. So they've got a fleet of aircrafts that are already being employed to address some of the PPE and other supplies across the continent. These just show you Johannesburg, Lagos, Abidjan, Libreville, which is where we have the current aircrafts that are being used. One part of this will be to recognize that, and again, this may be opportunities for some of you on the call or people within your networks will be establishing, and they'll be investing in the development of e-commerce performance centers in key hubs across the continent as we move that much more into a digital environment. And I had a long call this morning with the team that's actually focused on working with digitizing and moving towards a paperless customs system. So in this case, a lot of the customs administrations have weak infrastructure. The servers aren't appropriate. The levels of connectivity are non-existent to enable them to be able to expedite an automated and paperless system to be able to efficiently transact and process a lot of the private sector's requirements and all sort of goods. So this particular component of the partnership will be looking at a strategy to assist our customs administrations go paperless with what the phraseology that was coined is customs distancing, where it can bring the customs industry much closer to the whole safety of its employees. It can get access to technology because there'll be a cloud-based solution which will save the customs administrations themselves having to invest in the relevant software and hardware. So that just sort of gives you a picture on that side. And these are just sort of highlights where we sort of talk to the partners and the players that have invested in the platform to date. You know, it's got a great team, very dynamic team working across the continent. And again, from a business standpoint, as we are business people, it really does represent access to a $4 trillion opportunity with differentiated value propositions, and of course the growth potential in this new normal environment for our own domestic companies that we're going to be called on by our own governments to find very practical ways to support. This is going to be an issue. And then, of course, the partners that can make this happen and the access to global markets and global markets access to the continent, we think make for an interesting opportunity. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and just sort of leave that for you to be considering as you, and then raise any questions that you want. As I mentioned, we're going to go from one speaker to the next. So that was just our view on what could constitute a good initiative that we can take forward or we can support. The way that we're working with the UNDP is we've, as I mentioned, it's South Africa, Senegal, which is the other country. It's South Africa, Senegal, it's Ghana, it's Nigeria, and it's Ethiopia that are the starting countries. Ethiopia, because it's been designated as the PPE distributor for the entire continent for medical supplies on behalf of the African Union. Ghana, because that's where the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat is based, and this is going to be a key platform for the African Continental Free Trade Area to engage with the private sector and the procuring governments. Senegal, because it's got a key critical hub component for a number of the humanitarian aid organizations, so that will assist them be able to procure from that standpoint. South Africa, the South African government are very supportive, and of course, South Africa currently holds the chair of the African Union and is a big driver and will be convening African heads of state on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and there are lots of key players on the ground at the moment that are making a difference, and that will be contributing to this. Now, this does not mean that any of you are on this call from the continent can opt in and say, we would love to be able to work on creating this in Egypt or creating this in our own market. John's on the line. John and the International Chamber of Commerce are one of the partners, so all of the local and domestic chambers of commerce will also be brought on board in terms of the initiative on the platform. And in many cases, I'm sure that a number of these companies are ones that you feature in your investment portfolios in any respect. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm now going to move on to, that was recommendation one that I just addressed as a potential concrete idea and proposal that responds to the recommendation. I'm now going to call on Solomon Asamoah to address the recommendation number two, which is to pursue ESG compliant infrastructure co-investment partnerships with a particular focus on energy, healthcare, and the agriculture. One of the key things that we work on through the Continental Business Network as the investment interlocutor with African heads of state, and in particular, they have a group that I have to work closely with called PC, which is the acronym, which is the Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative. And that is chaired by President Cyril Ramaphosa, the current chair of the African Union, President Kenyatta, the president of Nigeria, the president of Egypt, the president of Rwanda, and a number of other, president of Ghana now, and a number of other presidents, about 14 presidents, who are looking to us to give them not only technical, commercial direction and advice as the African institutional investment community about what they need to put in place to be able to create more attractive investment opportunities, but also they're looking for our input and guidance on what regulations should they put in place. You know, we have a number of pension funds that want to invest in infrastructure, but sometimes we're told it's an illiquid asset class, or it's not structured in the way that it needs to be structured. So, this group here and this particular recommendation, I think, can also fulfill their deep passion and desire to see more co-investments at the institutional investment level in Africa, drive some of the major projects. Thank you very much, and I think that's a great way to end. And I don't think there's anything else to add other than please stay safe, everybody, and I look forward to following up with each of you in the coming days. So with that, the meeting is formally closed. Thank you very much.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.